Today on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Jodi Magness, one of the world's leading archaeologists of ancient Judaism and early Christianity. Dr. Magness is the Kenan Distinguished Professor for Teaching Excellence in Early Judaism at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She holds a PhD in Classical Archaeology from the University of Pennsylvania and a BA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. With over 20 seasons of excavation experience in Israel and Greece, she has dug at Masada, studied the mysteries of Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and currently directs the extraordinary excavations at Hukok, where her team has uncovered breathtaking ancient synagogue mosaics that are rewriting what we know about Jewish life in the Galilee. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the author of several groundbreaking books, including Stone and Dung, Oil and Spit, Jewish Daily Life in the Time of Jesus, and The Archaeology of the Holy Land. Today, she's taking us straight into the dirt beneath Jesus' feet to show us what archaeology has uncovered about Jerusalem in his time, the places he walked, the world he lived in, and the discoveries that are transforming how we understand the Gospels. Now it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, and today I have a very special guest with us, Dr. Magness. Dr. Magness, thank you so much for joining us today and taking some of your time to be with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Awesome. Let's jump right into the conversation, Dr. Magness. You spent decades excavating in Israel and have become one of the foremost voices in biblical archaeology. So what first drew you to dig in the dirt of the Holy Land? And how has that journey shaped the way you see the ancient world?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I actually wanted to be an archaeologist since I was 12 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, thanks to a seventh grade history teacher who introduced us to the ancient world. And I fell in love with ancient Greece, particularly with Athens. And from that point on, my interest really was always in the classical world. Wow. And then I ended up finishing high school and doing my undergraduate degree in Israel. So I ended up specializing sort of in the classical periods in Israel, right? The Roman, late Roman Byzantine periods in Israel. So that's kind of, how that came about.
That's amazing. So you were a little just digging around your backyard, digging stuff up and stuff?
Well, no, but actually my dad used to send me out to work in the garden saying, "What, you want to train to be an archaeologist?" Right? I was like, "Nah, that's not the same thing."
He tried to get one on you. He tried it.
Yeah.
He gets an E for effort for that.
Or creativity, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. You want to be an archaeologist? Go weed the garden for me then.
Right,
Go
exactly. It'll be good practice for you.
Yeah, right. Too funny. So for someone who has only read the Bible, but really never thought much about archaeology, why should they care about what's buried beneath the ground in Israel? How does archaeology change the way we read Scripture?
Right. Well, I mean, let me just divorce it from Scripture for a minute and just say, what does archaeology add to our understanding of the human past, right?
Sure.
So like history, archaeology is, a discipline that is concerned with the study of the human past. But historians would focus mainly or entirely on texts, literary sources. You asked about Scripture, but, whatever. Whereas archaeology is the study of human material culture. Gotcha. So that means that anything that humans manufactured and left behind and has survived is what archaeologists study to learn about the past. So you think about buildings or pottery or coins or, whatever. By the way, there are other things that archaeologists dig up that are not human material culture that are studied to learn about the past, but are not necessarily specialized in by archaeologists. So, for example, animal bones or human bones or paleobotanical remains like ancient plant remains or, things like that, which also provide information. And there are people who are specialists in those particular fields. But archaeology is the study of human material culture. So anything that humans manufactured and left behind. So, both archaeology and literary sources, and here I'll include broadly speaking Scripture, can inform us about the past, but generally give us different kinds of information. So, first of all, when you think about literary sources, whether it is the Bible or whether, it's Josephus or whoever else, those sources tend to be, well, pretty much were all written by men. They were all pretty much written by elite men, right? Men who were, wealthy and highly educated.
Right.
And the writings, therefore, reflect their particular point of view and their interests. So it's not necessarily a complete or necessarily an accurate representation of the past. Even if it is accurate, it's not complete, right? So if you think
Yes.
about the way Josephus presents, the events leading up to the first revolt, he skews things in certain ways. And that's not to say that it's always inaccurate, but there's spin
Of
sometimes,
course.
even in the best historical sources. And it gets, of course, much more problematic when we talk about scripture, right, about the Bible, which was not written as to be history. It was written for different purposes. And so that's not to say that you can't get historical information out of the Bible. You can,
Right.
but it's a matter of what kind of information. It has to be very carefully evaluated. Now, archaeology, when archaeologists dig up a site, we find all different kinds of remains. So we find buildings that were built and belong to wealthy people, right? Whether they're palaces or temples or big fortifications or whatever. But we also find the houses of everyday people and the poorer classes. We find different kinds of artifacts that tell us about their lives and lifestyles, and sometimes about the lives and lifestyles of people who otherwise don't really appear in literary sources. If you think
Hmm.
about like women or slaves or children or whatever. And so archaeology, in many cases, supplements the kind of information that we get from literary sources, and sometimes provides our only information because, of course, the literary sources that we have in here, I'll include the Bible, are not complete in their coverage. They tell us certain things, but they don't tell us about every time, every place, every site,
Right.
every different group of people. And one of the best examples I can give of this is one of my fields of specialization is ancient synagogues, and I've been excavating an ancient synagogue in Galilee that is paved with spectacular mosaics depicting an array of biblical stories. And, our main source of information on the period of these ancient synagogues, which basically is like 4th to 6th centuries AD, our main source of information for Judaism in this period are the writings of the rabbis.
Hmm.
And the rabbis were a group of elite men, and their writings actually really tell us little to nothing about ancient synagogues. And from their writings, we would never have guessed that there
Sure.
were synagogue buildings like this decorated with these kinds of figured mosaics. So archaeology really helps fill out our understanding of the past. And then sometimes, if we're fortunate, we can bring archaeology into conversation with the literary records that we have. So one great example would be the site of Masada, right, which Josephus talks about, and the famous quote unquote mass suicide story there, right? Herod's palaces. So there's an example where, we can look at what Josephus describes and we can take that with the archaeological remains and kind of put it together and gain a better understanding of the site. And that's, by the way, not to say that archaeology always supports what we have in the literary sources. Sometimes
Right.
it does not. But that's a case where, you have information from both kinds of sources, and you can, kind of see what you can do to make it fill out the picture that we have. So that's what I would say. And I know that you're interested in one of the books that I wrote, which is about daily Jewish life in the time of Jesus,
Yep.
and that's where again we don't get a lot of information about that from our literary sources. What kind of foods did people eat at that time? How were they preparing their foods? How did they dine? How did they serve their foods? What kind of clothing did they wear? What kind of toilet facilities were available to them, all these sorts of everyday things that might be mentioned in our literary sources, might be mentioned in the Bible, but only very incidentally, right? And so from archaeology, we can get a much fuller picture. And one of the things that I like to say is that, I'm often approached by TV documentary programs that are producing some program on, I don't know, another program on the Shroud of Turin, or one of these, right? Some artifact, the Holy Grail, something connected with Jesus. And what I always try to explain is that we don't have a specific, we do not have a specific artifact associated with Jesus. We do not. We do not have, well, we don't have the Holy Grail. We don't, we don't have anything like that. And there's a very good reason for that. And that is that Jesus was not a member of the elite. He was apparently a member of the majority of the population, which were poorer people, not to say that they were destitute, but certainly not elite. And the kinds of people who left identifiable remains in the archaeological record, where we can associate remains with a specific individual, almost always are elites. People who left their names on monuments or have monuments dedicated to them, right?
Right.
Those kind of people we can then associate, like we have Herod's tomb at Herodium. Okay, because, Herod was a king. We have Herod's offices. Right. We know, right?
Right.
But the problem with the majority of the population is that they didn't leave the kind of remains that we can identify with certainty in the archaeological record, because they didn't have monumental structures with inscriptions on them and stuff like that. And so like I like to say, it's possible actually that we have found the Holy Grail. I mean, it's possible that in archaeological excavations, we have dug up a cup, which was the cup out of which Jesus drank at the Last Supper. It's possible. But how would we know?
Right.
Unless you had an authentic ancient inscription on it that said, this is the cup out of which Jesus drank at the end. I mean, how would we know? Right. So what I always try to explain to these, documentary programs is, we can't, it's useless to focus on a specific artifact like that. But what we can do with archaeology, and this is really important, is to reconstruct the world of Jesus with a very high degree of accuracy. We know what Galilean villages looked like in the time of Jesus. Again, we know what people wore. We know what they ate and how they prepared their food. We know, all kinds of aspects of their everyday life. We can reconstruct that. We know what the Jerusalem temple looked like in the time of Jesus with a very high degree. So what was the city like when Jesus spent his final days on earth? We know what Jewish tombs looked like in that period. So all of that is really valuable, and reconstructing the world of Jesus gives a context to understanding what he was trying to say, right? So and so I think that that's really important to convey, that is the value of archaeology. And I know I'm going on about archaeology.
No,
but
it's
one more thing is that
it's amazing. It's you know what? It's a perspective that not many people focus on, right? Because you would have to think the elites are writing this stuff, right? Because most of the non-elites weren't able to read, weren't able to write, right? They were
didn't have the leisure time to do it, even if they did know how, right? So and so the elites are presenting their description of, from their point of view, first of all, of things that interest them, things that they think are important. And we don't get a lot of information about, what the majority of the population was doing necessarily.
Yeah.
But the other thing with archaeology that people have to realize is that, archaeology is a science. It's not an exact science. It can't be an exact science, because in the exact sciences, the goal is to replicate the experiment. And in archaeology, you can't replicate the experiment, meaning that archaeology is a destructive process. We retrieve the data by digging it up out of the ground, right? We dig the material up out of the ground that we hope will provide the information that we're looking for. But once you've dug that out of the ground, it's gone. You've destroyed it in the process. Right. You can never put it back the way it was. So in archaeology, unlike in the exact sciences, you only get one bite of the apple. And that's why, by the way, documentation and publication is so important in archaeology. And therefore, it's important to recognize that like every science, archaeology has limitations. It is equipped to answer certain types of questions, but not equipped to answer other kinds of questions. And so to give an example of that, so I might dig up a house, and maybe, if I'm lucky, based on what I find inside the different rooms, I might be able to speculate that this room maybe was used for storage. Maybe this room is used for cooking. I may be able to, at least at the end of the life of that house. I mean, the house might have been occupied for 100 years, and it could be that over the course of time they changed the rooms and they remodeled or whatever. But what I can say is, the moment when that house ceased to function, either was destroyed or was abandoned or whatever, based on what I find in it, I can maybe suggest what the different rooms were being used for. But I can't tell you who lived in those rooms, barring inscriptions or something like that. I can't tell you who lived in those rooms. I can't tell you if they were men, women, children necessarily, right? Or slaves or whatever necessarily, again, depending on what was found in them. And I can't tell you what those people were thinking, right? I can't tell you what they believed unless, again, you find like some very clear indication of a religious belief or orientation,
Sure.
associated with those rooms. I can't tell you what they were thinking, right?
Right.
So literary sources might tell you what people were thinking, or at least what the author or authors were thinking.
Right.
But you won't necessarily. So again, it's a matter of asking the right questions, right? Recognizing this is the kind of information that archaeology can provide, but there are certain questions that archaeology cannot answer.
Gotcha. Gotcha. That makes sense. So your book, Stone and Dung, Oil and Spit. I mean, what a title.
I know it was
What
not
a
my title. It was not my title. My title was far more boring. And that was the title that the publisher gave to it, and I have not heard the end of it ever since
What
then.
was your title? What was the title you had?
Aspects of Jewish Daily Life in Late Second Temple Period Palestine.
So they turned that. Hey, listen. I got a better one.
And then, and one day they emailed me and they said, "Well, we decided this is going to be the title of your book." So,
No, listen, it is it catches your attention for sure.
Yeah, I know.
What were some of the most surprising things you discovered about how ordinary Jewish people, like you said, lived, ate, and practiced their faith?
Yeah. No, there's a lot of really interesting things, and now I'm not even sure that what I'm going to say is in that book, because I've done so much work over the years that I can't think of that's fair. But there's one. I'll just give you an example for food, right? A really interesting little food item. So one of my fields of specialization is ancient pottery, which usually bores people to death. My dissertation was on pottery, but pottery is really interesting because aside from being used to date things, which is how archaeologists use pottery a lot of the time, it can also tell us about diet and dining habits, right? How did people set their table? What kind of foods did they prepare? If you think about it for a minute, if you go into a kitchen of somebody who's Italian versus somebody who's Chinese, they're going to have completely different kinds of cooking vessels, right, cooking pots, and dining dishes, because they have, they eat and prepare different kinds of foods. Right. So the kinds of dishes and the kinds of pots that you have reflect different kinds of food preparations, different kinds of foods, different ways of serving. And so one of the very interesting things I found is that, and this is actually a well-known kind of pottery, in Galilee, in the time of Jesus, actually, during the lifetime of Jesus, a very distinctive kind of cooking pan. It's a very shallow, flat-based, circular pan made of cooking ware appears, and it becomes universal. It has two little handles on either side. They tend to be quite large. And it's clearly a local imitation of, or inspired by, a very common kind of Roman cooking pan called a patina or a patella. So we know a lot about Roman cooking and dining because the Romans had a very sophisticated culinary culture and wrote a lot of cookbooks that have survived. And, you can actually go online and look up Roman recipes that are adapted. Actually, I think we would, if we could go back, we would think that Roman cooking is really gross in many ways. But anyway, but among other things, the Romans really liked eggs a lot. I mean, they had all kinds of different preparations with eggs. And one of the things that was one of the most common dishes among Romans was a preparation where you could take meat or fish or fruits or vegetables or whatever, and you chopped it up, and then you would put it into this shallow pan and then beat eggs and pour the eggs over, and then either cook it on the stove or in the oven. So you either get a quiche or a frittata, depending on how you were cooking it, right? And so what's really interesting is that this imitation of these Roman pans, which are used for the preparation of this specific kind of dish. So a local imitation appears in Galilee in the time of Jesus.
Wow.
And very quickly becomes ubiquitous. I mean, they're found, in huge numbers all over the place in Galilee, and they remain popular. They kind of evolve a little over time, but they remain popular for centuries afterwards at Jewish settlements. And they were even produced in Jewish workshops in Galilee.
Wow.
And what's so interesting is that in Judea, the area around Jerusalem, there's nothing like this. So somehow in Galilee, this kind of egg dish becomes very popular and very common beginning in the time of Jesus. And for whatever reason, didn't become popular in Judea. And so I think we can actually say that Jesus ate quiche.
Nice, nice. So he's either a quiche or frittata guy, one of the two,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Who knew, right?
So that's
You think about the
and
loaves and the fishes, but you got to add quiche now into that.
absolutely.
And by the way, the loaves and the fishes thing is also really interesting because the dietary staples in the Eastern Mediterranean, so if you go from Greece eastwards, right, the dietary staples were bread, olive oil, and then something, a relish that went with that. So you would
Okay.
have a vegetable, or you would have a dip, like a hummus or something like that. In Greece, and also, by the way, I assume in the area of the Sea of Galilee, that item that went with your bread and olive oil was fish. And in fact, in Greek, it's called hopson, which is the root of the modern Greek word psari, which means fish,
Hmm.
because it was a staple. So the loaves and the fishes actually represent the dietary staples of the local population.
Oh wow, very
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
Very interesting.
yeah.
We read about places in the Bible about like the Pool of Siloam
Mhm.
and the Pool of Bethsaida in the Gospels. Have these sites been found?
Oh yeah,
Like,
yeah.
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 What?
And yeah, in fact, it's funny. Yesterday, I teach an undergraduate class on archaeology. Basically, it's titled New Testament archaeology. But yesterday we actually talked about the Pool of Siloam because
Hmm,
we do have the Pool of Siloam. Now there are actually two pools of Siloam next to each other at the southern end of the city of David, right to the south of the Temple Mount. The one that most people might be familiar with is the one at the outlet of Hezekiah's Tunnel, but that one is kind of a later. It's a later pool. The earlier pool, the original one from the time of Jesus, is slightly to the south, slightly lower down in the valley than that, and is enormous. And it's been undergoing excavation now by Israeli archaeologists for a number of years. It's this huge
okay.
pool surrounded by steps on all sides. It was basically a giant mikveh. It was
Wow.
basically a giant ritual bath.
Wow.
And
Okay.
so, yes, it's very interesting. Yeah.
And does it show anything about the accuracy of how the scriptures maybe located? Like, have you seen? I'm sure there's discrepancies and there's a lot of debate of when the Bible mentions this place is here and that place is there. What are some of these findings? I guess how do they confirm or guess I don't want to use the word deny, but maybe confirm some of the things that the scripture locate said.
Right. Well, I mean, there, what you really have to do is go on a case by case basis. I mean,
Okay.
it's not, you can't just do a one size fits all. And the reason I'm hesitating here is because that reference, and there are a few others, are only in the Gospel of John, right?
Yep.
The fourth Gospel. And I've actually written about this because so let me just qualify and say that I am an archaeologist and I'm not a New Testament scholar, even though I use the New Testament in my research anyway. And I actually think that the New Testament in general and the Gospels in particular, and especially the Synoptic Gospels, are really valuable sources of information on Jewish daily life in the time of Jesus. But all of that said, so as you know, the fourth gospel is different from the others, and
Right.
has different information, different presentation, different theological agenda, and so on and so forth.
Sure.
And it's also the latest, thought to be the latest of the gospels, and the most far removed in space. So the most far removed in time and space, probably dated to around 100. Maybe John, whoever authored it, was over in the area of like Ephesus or Asia Minor, whatever. So far removed. So what's interesting. So for me, when I look at the gospel accounts, I generally tend to sort of gravitate more towards Mark, maybe Matthew, and a little Luke, and not so much towards John,
Right.
because I'm more interested in the historical Jesus, right?
Sure.
That's my thing. But all of that said, and a number of scholars have pointed this out, John does have a number of places where he includes references to sites in Jerusalem and elsewhere around the country that are not mentioned in the other three gospels. And the question is whether he is drawing on an independent source of information that goes back to the historical Jesus or not. Right.
Right.
And so I've looked at some of these, and one of them, in fact, was this business with the Pool of Siloam and with and I have been unable to conclude that this information in fact does go back to the time of Jesus, to the historical Jesus, and is not something that John picked up and added in for theological reasons. And so to give an example. So you have the incident of the sheep's pools, right?
Okay.
And where there's he does this healing at the sheep's pools. Now we have the actual sheep's pools in Jerusalem. They're in the old city. You can go. They're north of the Temple Mount, and the sheep's pools were actually, again, a giant, like mikvah, giant ritual bath used for purification. And he describes this healing where this man is healed and picks up his bed, right, and walks
Right.
away. And so okay, so maybe somehow this is connected with the historical Jesus, but the problem that I have is with that is that we have no evidence that mikvah ritual baths were associated with healing
Okay.
in Judaism, in ancient Judaism. Now, that's not to say that they weren't, but there are no references to
I got
these
you.
healing sites. Whereas after 70, when Jerusalem became a Roman colony, Aelia Capitolina, that site of the sheep's pools became a healing sanctuary
Interesting.
under the Romans. And so is that tradition, right, in John reflecting actually the reality that is post 70?
I got you. So is it a
Right?
possibility that post 70, he's kind of merging what it became to what it was before?
Exactly. And
Right.
so that's just giving an example. And I went through, a number of these instances, not all of them, but I went through, a few of them in the Gospel of John, and I was unable to conclude that these, in fact, I can't rule out the possibility, but I was unable to conclude that these go back to, that these are authentic pieces of information that go back to the historical Jesus. But again, I think that there are in total, looking at the Gospels, and again, especially at the Synoptics, the earlier Gospels, that there is interesting and valuable information. But with John, and because you mentioned the Pool of Siloam, which
Yeah.
again, I could not conclude it about that in that case.
Gotcha. Now, we mentioned Pool of Siloam. I got to mention Masada. I know we spoke about it very briefly before. You've excavated Masada, one of the most, just one of the most dramatic sites in all of Israel, right? So for those unfamiliar, let's introduce, because my audience is newer Christians, I don't know, more critical thinkers of the scriptures, kind of walking themselves through it. So let's just kind of base level for those unfamiliar. What happened there? Why does Masada continue to captivate scholars throughout the world?
Sure. And I wrote a book about Masada, which was published in 2018. So, and it is a trade book. So it is written to be accessible to non-specialists.
Oh, great.
In case your listeners are
I'll
interested.
link it all up in the descriptions. I'll link all
Great,
these
thank
books
you.
up.
And let me just qualify and say, you said I excavated Masada. So Masada is a mountain overlooking the Dead Sea that had a fortress and palaces built by King Herod the Great on top in the 1st century BC. I did, and those remains on top of Masada were excavated in the 1960s by a very famous Israeli archaeologist named Yigael Yadin.
Okay.
Those are not my excavations. So I co-directed excavations in 1995 at the foot of Masada in Roman siege works at the foot of Masada. So just to clarify, I can't take credit for that.
Gotcha.
Anyway, so in the 1st century BC, Herod fortified the top of Masada, built palaces up there. What's famous about Masada, and of course the palaces are magnificent, and people now go to Masada and are impressed by how beautifully decorated they are in the middle of this very barren wilderness overlooking the Dead Sea. But the reason why Masada is famous is because 70 years after Herod's death, a Jewish revolt broke out against the Romans, the first Jewish revolt. And at the time the revolt broke out, the top of the mountain was taken over by Jewish rebels who held out there even after the revolt officially ended in the year 70 AD. So in 70 AD, the revolt officially ended when the Romans took Jerusalem and destroyed the Second Temple. But Masada continued to hold out and was not actually taken by the Romans until 3 years later. And the story of the siege and fall of Masada is told by the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived at the time of the revolt. He was not present at the siege of Masada, but lived at the time of the revolt, and who wrote this massive 7-volume work about the revolt called the Jewish War or the Judean War, and concludes this massive account of the war with the siege and fall of Masada. And he basically says that what happens at the end, the Romans besiege the mountain. And again, I was involved in the excavation of Roman siege works at the foot of the mountain. The Romans besiege the mountain, and then they go up and they're about to take it. The mountain's about to fall to them, and they all decide to kill themselves instead of giving themselves alive to the Romans, right? There's this kind of mass suicide. There's a whole procedure. And that is what has, garnered so much attention. Thanks to Josephus's story, very early in, the history of the state of Israel, Masada became kind of a symbol of the state of Israel, right? That, this isolated country surrounded by enemies on all sides, and Masada shall not fall again, that kind of thing. And then was excavated by this sort of legendary Israeli archaeologist, Yigael Yadin, who was also chief of staff of the Israeli army at, some point in his life. So it all becomes, tied up with this, mythologizing of the modern state of Israel. The story of Masada becomes bound up with that, becomes very famous. And in fact, until today, Masada is, I think this is accurate to say, the second most visited archaeological site in Israel.
Oh,
the
very
first
cool.
the first one is I think this is accurate. The first one is Caesarea, which is another one of Herod's sites on the coast, but that gets more visitors because it's very close to Tel Aviv, so it's easy to get to. And yeah. Masada apparently is just behind it. So a lot of people visit Masada when they go to Israel. In fact, I have stuck to my corkboard in my office, I have an old newspaper clipping of Bill and Hillary Clinton on top of Masada.
Oh, really?
Yes. And then when Trump was elected his first term, you may recall this, at the very beginning of his first term, he went to Israel.
Yep, I do remember that.
Yeah, it was like a 22-hour visit or something crazy like that. And I happened to be in Israel at that time. Oh, wow. And the Israelis were going nuts trying to figure out what to cram into the 22 hours. Like, what's the most important thing that we need to show, President Trump in the 22 hours that he's here? And I was really surprised that Masada was one of the sites. I was really? Like, of all the sites that they're going to take him to, they're going to take him to Masada. It just goes to show the sort of symbolic importance of Masada. In the end, and you may even recall this, he never went to Masada. And the reason is, there's a cable car that goes to the top of Masada, but he didn't want to take the cable car. He wanted a helicopter. He wanted to go by helicopter to Masada, and the Israelis, rightfully, by the way, would not allow a helicopter to land on top of Masada because it would have damaged the archaeological remains there, right? So he ended up not visiting Masada in the end. But yeah, that was like on their list of like, we got to take him to Masada.
That's funny. That's funny. Yeah. Trump damaging Masada with a helicopter. Wow. Breaking the archaeological. That's funny. Just a couple more questions. Now, I think I got this right. You're currently directing the excavations at Hukuk. Is that correct? Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's the ancient synagogue that I mentioned. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So where your team hasn't covered, right, the mosaics, what have you found there, even more specifically than the mosaics, if anything? And what do you think is so significant for our understanding of the Jewish life during this time, if you have any other things that you can mention about that? Right.
Well, okay, great question. So Hukok, it's a really weird name. I know it looks very strange when you spell it in English. It comes out Huqoq.
Yeah.
It's really right in the middle of Jesus Central. It's like just a couple of miles from Capernaum, the base of Jesus's Galilean ministry, and a couple of miles from Magdala, Migdal, the hometown of Mary Magdalene. And it's not mentioned in the New Testament, but I mean, given its location, I think it's not unlikely that Jesus was familiar with the village. It was a Jewish village in the time of Jesus. And who knows, maybe even wandered through it at some point. But my interest in Hukok has always been not in the remains from the time of Jesus, but rather the centuries afterwards, specifically the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, when the Roman Empire became a Christian empire. And Jewish villages like Hukok came under Christian rule. And I started the excavations hoping to answer the question, what was the fate of these Jewish villages under Christian rule? Because many of my colleagues, especially in Israel, think that Christian rule was oppressive to Jews and that these settlements declined and some of them were even abandoned Whereas my impression from the archaeology was always exactly the opposite, that these
Wow.
villages continued to prosper and flourish in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. And that's why I started my excavations at Hukok.
Right.
And our results support my point of view. Now, this doesn't indicate that this is true of every village in the area,
Right.
but at least at Hukok, we have a monumental synagogue building with extraordinary mosaics that was built around the year 400 AD, and the dating is actually pretty secure. So right in smack in the middle of this period of supposed decline, we have the villagers constructing this extraordinary synagogue building, which reflects, a very high level of wealth in the village. And it is a village; it's not a town, so it's pretty surprising, and therefore again supports my point of view. Now, what has garnered all the attention are the mosaics paving the synagogue, and you'll provide links. People can go online. We have a dig website, hukok.org, with images, photographs of the mosaics, publications about the mosaics, media coverage, all sorts of biblical stories represented, scenes with Samson and scenes from the book of Daniel and Noah's Ark and the Pharaoh's soldiers drowning in the Red Sea and Jonah and the fish and the building of the Tower of Babel. And it just goes on and on and on. So amazing. Yes, we have an extraordinary array of biblical stories depicted in our mosaics. We also have some of the ancient village. We excavated, some houses in the village from the time of the synagogue. And we have later remains above the synagogue, including a very important but generally overlooked rebuilding of the synagogue as a synagogue in the late Middle Ages, the 14th century AD. So there's all sorts of remains that we found that are important. But again, what's gotten the most attention are the mosaics. And once people see the pictures of the mosaics, you'll understand why.
Yeah, I'm going to put that link in there too. All right, real quick. One of the things that you have uncovered that dramatically changed or shifted, like the way you understand the world of the Bible, like what's something that you saw that you uncovered? You were like, wow, like this changes what I think of the historical Jesus or the world that Jesus lived in.
That's an interesting question. So I'm not sure that this is the thing, because I'd have to give some thought to that.
Yeah, just throw this stuff out there right on the spot.
Yeah, no, right. So right off the top of my head, I would say something that's connected with my current research project, which involves Herod. And that is the discovery of Herod's tomb at Herodium, which occurred in 2007, but I think has not gotten the attention that it deserves. And the reason I say that is because Herod's mausoleum, turns out that Herod was buried in a mausoleum that indicates that he was representing himself sort of in the line of Alexander the Great, kind of connected to Augustus, kind of this kind of, deified.
I was going to say this divine, right?
Yes. And very interesting, but also the proximity of Herodium, the tomb, the mausoleum, overlooking Bethlehem, which of course brings about all sorts of associations with Davidic messiahs. And I'm exploring the possibility of claims of Herodian messianism, that Herod claimed to have fulfilled the expectations associated with the Davidic Messiah. And I think the placement of his tomb, literally towering over Bethlehem, is trying to make that claim. It's a hypothesis that a couple of other scholars have suggested, mainly in relation to his rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple, again, connecting himself to David and to Solomon and even outdoing them. So that I think is the most, I actually think that the discovery of Herod's mausoleum or tomb at Herodium, again, which occurred in 2007, is the most important archaeological discovery in the area, in the region, since the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Wow.
And I do. And I think that because, nearly all of our information about Herod comes from Josephus. And Josephus was born like 40 years after Herod died. So he never met Herod. He's drawing on other sources. And he presents, for various reasons, most of his presentation of Herod is pretty negative. Negative. And so Herod gets this now that's not to say that Herod wasn't a bad guy. He was a bad guy. Yeah, but Josephus's presentation is very negative. And the only other the main other way that you think about Herod is, of course, the story of the massacre of the innocents in the Gospel of Matthew. Again, he becomes infamous because he tries to have, the Messiah killed, right? And so what's important, I think, about Herod's mausoleum at Herodium is that it reflects Herod's desire to be, how he's representing himself, how he wants to be remembered for posterity. And so it's the closest we come to actually hearing directly from Herod about himself. And we don't have that from other sources. And by the way, I also think that if you think about the story of the massacre of the innocents, and this, it keeps, one of the points of the story is it keeps reiterating, David being born in Bethlehem, and the real Messiah is born in Bethlehem, and this is the true Messiah because he's descended from David, and Bethlehem, Bethlehem, Bethlehem. This guy's looking at Herod's, mausoleum overlooking Bethlehem. Wow. So it's almost like in my, I'd like to suggest it's kind of a reaction, right? A reaction to. So the reaction is Herod is not the Messiah. Herod is not connected to David, not descended from David. In fact, he tried to have the real Messiah, who is descended from David, put to death, and so I think that, there's all sorts of interesting things to play with there.
Man, fascinating. All right, really, for real now, last question. The archaeology sometimes confirms what we read in the Bible. Sometimes it complicates it. I guess the advice, how do you navigate some of that tension? And what advice would you give people of faith who want to take both the Bible and the evidence seriously at the same time?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the right person to ask that question. Because my approach is not based on a faith approach.
Sure.
It's
understandable
historical, archaeological, scientific approach. So I'm not using or reading the Bible for out of faith. I'm using it in a way to try and get information that I think might be helpful in understanding the past.
Sure.
So I really don't have good advice except to say that again, I think people have to realize that I always say my goal is not to undermine anybody's faith or beliefs.
Of course.
My goal is to educate and inform, and people are welcome to believe, whatever they want. Right. But I mean, I guess I would just say that the Bible, and this includes the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, were not written as history books in the modern sense of the word. Even books that were written as history books, like Josephus's works,
right?
There's no concept of objectivity in the modern sense of the word, and many scholars today don't believe that objectivity is even desirable or possible. But that's not the goal of the writers, right? So to take these works and to say, oh, we can just take them and on face value reconstruct history, that was not the purpose of the writing. And so, I mean, I think I can't, far be it for me to try and say how people should reconcile their personal beliefs in scripture with archaeological evidence, right? I would just say, so, and I would also add, this goes back to the beginning, archaeology is not intended to, nor should it ever intend to be used to verify what's in the Bible. I mean, we can use them as complementary sources of information when we can in a critical way, but that's not the way archaeology should be used, right? So that's not right. That's not a correct use of archaeology.
Gotcha. Fair enough. Dr. Jodi Magness, thank you so much. This was so fun and learned a ton. I truly appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Oma. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.